So I'm Will Milberg. I want to welcome you to our first fall event in the Arnhold Global Forum. Very pleased to see many people here tonight. Very happy to see President Towers, all of the deans from the New School. It should be a very exciting evening. This year's theme of the forum is Challenges to Democracy, and Dean Alenikoff has asked me and Jim Miller to organize the series, of which this is the first. Next week, the next event is October 9th. The title is Democracy, Revolution, and Tyranny, that Jim Miller has organized. And tonight, of course, we have a very distinguished speaker, a crucial perspective on the challenges to American democracy. So President Towers will give us a short welcome. Derek Hamilton will introduce our speaker, and yes, eventually we will get to our speaker. I hope, if time permits, we will have a time to ask some questions of our speaker. And will you please welcome Joel Towers to the microphone?
Thank you. Good evening. And let me first, of course, thank Professors Will Milberg and Jim Miller for your tireless efforts. Where's Jim? Where'd you go? Oh, there you are, sitting in the back. For your tireless efforts, both this year and previously, for this lecture series, and for bringing really critical voices together to cast an increasing spotlight on the declining democratic norms and to seek an understanding for the causes and the impacts domestically and internationally. Tonight, as Will said, we will further that focus with Professor Gloud's talk. We are immensely honored to welcome you to the New School. And my colleague, Professor Derek Hamilton, as you just heard, will be introducing you, but I wanted to just say how deeply meaningful it is for us that you are having this first lecture on the critical issues facing this country. The New School also wants to thank the Arnhold family for their longstanding and consistent support of the New School, and in particular, John and Joni Arnhold, who endowed this series in 2021. They and Henry Arnhold, who was a deeply committed friend and trustee of the New School for decades, would want us to be exploring the ways in which democracy is in peril, how it's unevenly experienced or outright denied. They would, more than ever, demand of us our attention and our intellect at this moment, and I can think of no better way to honor that than with tonight's talk. So let me get to that. It's my pleasure to introduce Derek Hamilton. Derek is a dear friend, but he is also a university professor and the Henry Cohn Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy here at the New School. Considered one of the nation's foremost public intellectuals, Derek Hamilton redefines how an economy should work, identifies powerful opportunities for investment in human capacity, and propels collaboration alongside field leaders to advance the realization of economic inclusion, social equity, and civic engagement for all people in the United States and across the world. He's one of the pioneers of identity group stratification, and he has profiled in the New York Times, Mother Jones, Bloomberg Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, that's just this week, I think. He has developed and collaborated on transformational policy proposals that have shifted billions of dollars into the hands of people, inspiring legislative proposals at federal, state, and local levels, including baby bonds, even if some of the ideas around those have been ripped off. Is that a good way of putting it, Derek? Guaranteed income and federal job guarantee. He was named a Freedom Scholar by the Marguerite Casey Foundation, and he advises national and global leaders on economic policy, including the Joint Economic Committee and the Senate Banking Committee. Please welcome Professor Hamilton.
So getting introduced by Joe will never get old. I'm honored, I'm humbled, and the main reason we're here today is Dr. Eddie Gloud. I can't talk, I'm tongue-tied, but I'm gonna get it right. I'm on leave this semester, but I absolutely was gonna come back and do this. I was jumping with glee when Will gave me the call to ask me to come back and do this introduction. I absolutely was gonna do it. I won't do justice in this introduction with all the gratitude I have from watching, learning from him and what he does for this whole world and his willingness and bravery to do it because he can choose many paths. Dr. Eddie Gloud is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He was the inaugural chair of that department and served in that role for over 14 years. And if you don't know, that is a department that has great influence, great scholarship, and filled with a bunch of superstars. And to lead that, he's a leader of leaders. If you go through it, it's collegial, the way it works, it's a model. He also serves on the Morehouse College Board of Trustees, and they recently made a hire of Du Bowman, so thank you for that. He was an outstanding president. He's a passionate educator, author, political commentator, public intellectual who examines the complex dynamics of race relations and the American experience. And using words like passionate, public intellectual, that's what we need. By every means, he's grounded in rigor and thought, but he's not afraid to lead with his values when he pursues this work. His writings include Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, In the Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, and the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and the Urgent Lessons of Our Own. His more recent book, We Are the Leaders We've Been Looking For, has been described as a lyrical meditation of how ordinary people can shake off their reliance on small group of professional politicians and assume responsibility of what it takes to achieve a more just and perfect democracy. And the book that he's going to talk about today, what an amazing topic, what an amazing title. What a juxtaposition of the celebration of America against the blight that it has, which he's going to talk about today, and I'm looking forward to hearing, but I'm excited. Look at it. That is exactly a good framing to understand both the joy of what we should be celebrating and the unfulfilled promise and the blight that very well might be constraining it for fulfilling that promise. He frequently appears in the media as a columnist for Time magazine, as an MSNBC contributor on programs like The Morning Joe, Dateline White House with Nicole Wallace, and regularly appears on Meet the Press Sundays, combining a scholarly knowledge of history, political commentation. He takes on latest events and an activist passion for social justice. Professor Gloud challenges all of us to examine our collective American conscience. So again, doesn't shy away from public intellectual. He not only creates knowledge, he's very committed to making that knowledge translate into improving people's lives. He looks at the intersections of identity, politics, and economics, but he also has a spiritual humanist grounding in that work. And if you don't hear it, I'm really trying to emphasize that I'm motivated by King when he talks about love and power. Well, Dr. Gloud does both. He's grounded in his humanist values of spiritualness, in the tradition of Dr. King, Morehouse, etc., but bringing that spiritual guidance, that spiritual grounding to fruition with rigor and with movement building. It's also the tradition of the New School. So we can be proud also as an institute that from our founding, we've always been committed to a moral consciousness grounded in rigor and trying to make the world a better place. So I'm going to sum up so you can hear from him, but I can say that work is not only interested in ensuring that individuals, we were just talking about what took place in Mississippi with the hanging of a Black person, and clearly those intersections, and of course it's not being reported as such, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, but nonetheless, thinking about those intersections of politics, economics, identity with a spiritual grounding on an individual level, he also extrapolates and talks about it at a structural level, which is just as important. So finally, he is exactly what we need right now. He's exactly what we need tomorrow. His work is brilliant, grounded in values, and most importantly, brave. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek, for that gracious introduction. I wish my mama could have heard it. Let me switch glasses. I've gotten old. Thank you for that introduction. You know, I've been following your path-breaking work for years now. And I know what you're doing, how you're breaking through. To have people like Cory Booker and others embrace your ideas at the level of whatever they're doing in Washington, D.C., but the way it has currency among everyday ordinary folk. So I just wanted to say in front of all of your colleagues and your community how much we appreciate you and what you're doing for the country and for our community. I also want to extend my heartfelt thanks to President Towers. I know you're just starting out on this journey, so you are in my prayers. What a time to take the helm. And it's in this moment that we need courageous leadership, visionary leadership, people who will double down on the values that define an institution like the New School. And I'm so committed to the New School in so many ways as an undergraduate and graduate, graduate student, this place is in my imagination where, you know, a lot of my theoretical resources resided. I mean, one of the joys of my life was having Dick Bernstein blurb my book in a shade of blue, right? So I said, oh, I've reached the pinnacle of pragmatism now that Richard Bernstein has done that. So I want to thank William Milberg for reaching out and Brother Miller, Professor Miller, and the organizers for extending the invitation to deliver the Arnhold Global Formal Lecture. These are indeed troubling times. And it seems, especially these days, that occasions to gather and think together are important. At least for me they are, to beat back, if just for a moment, the sinking feeling of helplessness as we witness an all-out assault on our democracy. So I'm delighted to join with you tonight to offer a few thoughts about our troubles, capital T. This is going to be from my new book. It's the first time I've ever read anything from it out loud to any community, so be gentle. And if I'm going on too long, just raise your hand and say, shut up, and we're going to be democratic in this thing, right? On the back of his copy of the manumission papers for Moses Gordon, issued in 1776, John Parrish, a Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia, scribbled a sentence about Gordon's death. Gordon chose, Parrish wrote, to, quote, drown himself rather than being sold from his connections, end quote. An offhand note, a reminder of the all too human stakes of the fight against slavery. Moses had been captured as a fugitive under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Law. For a little over 10 years, he had lived in Philadelphia as a free man, attended church, perhaps at the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas on the corner of what was then 5th and Adelphi Street, pastored by Absalom Jones, the first African-American to be ordained an Episcopalian priest in the United States. He met and married the love of his life, and with her raised 4 children. He worked hard to secure his family's needs and found himself a part of a vibrant community of Black people, some of whom, like himself, had escaped slavery. His life in Philadelphia, of course, was haunted by the specter of the peculiar institution, not only by the fact of slavery in the South that some people suffered as the property of others, but by the hard reality that even if you escape slavery, even if you manage to build a life uniquely your own, you would be forever condemned to look over your shoulder for the four horsemen who wanted to drag you back to hell. This was by design. The Constitution made it so that people like Moses Gordon could not feel secure in their freedom, even in a so-called free state. 48 years after Moses was captured, Frederick Douglass described that world in his 1845 autobiography, quote, "Let him be a fugitive in a strange land, a land given up to be the hunting ground for slaveholders, whose inhabitants are legalized kidnappers, where he is every moment subjected to the terrible liability of being seized upon by his fellow men. I say, let him place himself in my situation among fellow men, yet feeling in the midst of wild beasts." End quote. In Philadelphia, no matter the life he lived, Moses remained stolen property. He was a thief in the contorted sense that he had stolen himself. He could only be made free by white men, and his life proved that just as easily as white men can make you free, they can take it away. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which guaranteed to slave owners the right to reclaim escaped slaves, and the fugitive law, slave law of 1793, gave license to the hunt. Moses' life in Philadelphia was not his first experience of freedom, however. Caleb Trueblood, a slaveholding North Carolina Quaker, had come to believe that slavery was a sin against God, and in November of 1776, just 3 months after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, he released Moses from bondage. It was a radical act. Colonial North Carolina had passed a law that strictly forbade masters, quote, from liberating their slaves except for meritorious service, end quote. The law was necessary, some argued, because Quakers like Trueblood threatened the foundations of the institution, increasing the size of the free black population, unsettled the assumptions underlying slavery itself. What is a black slave to think when she sees free black people living among her? Slaveholders, no matter how hard they tried, could not escape the paranoia that came with holding others in bondage, even as they argued that slaves were loyal and content with their status. The existence of fugitives and the free suggested otherwise. Both sounded a note of dread in the hearts of slaveholders. 4 months after Caleb Trueblood freed Moses Gordon, the North Carolina legislature passed another law. The preamble to the statute made clear the crime manumission represented, quote, diverse evil persons intending to disturb the peace did liberate and set free their slaves, end quote. No matter the order surrounding the ideals of liberty and freedom so central to the American Revolution, North Carolina legislators, and they were not alone, continued to defend and expand slavery. The law ordered those manumitted illegally to be captured and, quote, sold to the highest bidder. Moses had been free for 2.5 years when he was arrested by the sheriff and sold in July 1779 to William Skinner, a brigadier general in the North Carolina militia. Skinner served as a judge until 1789 and owned 47 people. Imagine the broken heart and the rage that accompanied Moses as he was placed in chains and handed over to another white man to taste freedom and to lose it against the backdrop of declarations of liberty and freedom must have been a bitter pill to swallow. For the next 6 years, Moses harbored freedom dreams. He eventually escaped Skinner's grasp under the cover of morning darkness in October of 1785. Soon he was hundreds of miles away, but Skinner never relented. Moses had stolen his property. Skinner offered a reward for Moses' return, $10 reward, he said, will be paid for apprehending and delivering to me my Negro man named Moses, who after being detected of some villainy ran away this morning about 4 o'clock, or I will give 5 times the sum to any person that make due proof of his being killed and never ask a question to know by whom it was done, end quote. Wanted dead or alive, ultimately for a villainy of wanting to be free. Skinner's reward had no expiration date. It announced no matter what needed to be done or how long it took that Moses Gordon belonged to him. Moses was captured finally and jailed in 1797. over 10 years after his escape and many years after having created a new life with a family and in a beloved community, when faced with the hard choice of living as a slave or as a free man, he chose death by his own hand. Skinner had the power of the law behind him. The Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 empowered slave owners to seek rendition of, quote, their property in federal or state court. The law also imposed a fine on anyone who knowingly and willingly obstructed the return of a runaway. These were the results of the maddening compromises that paved the way for the founding of the nation. Just 5 years after the ratification of the Constitution, lawmakers felt no need to end slavery or the slave trade. Instead, they decided to secure the rights of those who owned slaves. As the historian Ira Berlin puts it, quote, the Declaration of Independence made equality normative, leaving only one logical rationale for denying freedom to any people, namely that they were not human. That lie made it possible for Black people who dared to steal their freedom to be hunted down like dogs. The resolution of the problem of believing in equality and holding people as slaves, if one can call it that, required holding in the balance and in the nation's bosom two contradictory positions, that ours was a country committed to both freedom and unfreedom, that slavery could sit, however uneasily, alongside the developing myth of America as a city on a hill or as the Redeemer Nation. Everyone touched by the peculiar institution was complicit. This was America, U.S.A. The fact that Black people were held in bondage or relegated to second-class status mattered little in the nation's redemptive mission of spreading freedom and democracy around the world. The American future was and would be unburdened by its failures. America, slaveholding or not, was a divinely sanctioned project, and that consensus myth secured our national virtue despite the divisions that threatened to crack the country wide open. The title of the book is America, U.S.A. It's a riff on Dos Passos' U.S.A. And what I'm trying to do is to kind of think through why Dos Passos thinks he was offered, why does he believe that he offered this kind of epic account of the U.S. and Black folk enter into the story, if they do at all, as these flat characters, almost stereotypical flat characters, sounding like Amos and Andy, if they sounded at all, right? If they spoke at all. I'm trying to deal with the division, the divided soul of the country, the double consciousness that I attribute to America that is often attributed to us, Black folk, right? That double consciousness is the country imagines itself at once as a beacon of freedom and at the same time as a white republic. The divided soul of the country was not simply a failure to live up to stated ideals, nor was it an abstraction. It had concrete effects felt in the lives of those who bore the brunt of it. America, U.S.A. was split between its commitments to liberty and equality and to the idea of white superiority. In one moment, the country could embrace the idea of freedom and liberty for all, and that could include Black people, and it did for some and for a brief time during the Revolution. And then, as quickly as storm clouds can hide the sun, the mood darkened, and that freedom could be snatched away. The act was especially cruel, a repetition of the evil and the hubris at the heart of slavery and the slave trade itself. These traffickers of human beings would arrogate to themselves as if they were gods, who could be free or not, and could easily change their minds. Black people were caught up as profit and prejudice collided with justice and virtue. People like Moses Gordon knew this intimately. What might freedom mean here, in this place, where so many languished in chains and so many claimed freedom as their possession? What might it mean for the nation when the measure of freedom is found in white men? Both the Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Act were born in Philadelphia, the nation's capital, until 1800, in many ways still the beating heart of the American story. Not for nothing were all major anniversary celebrations held there well into the 20th century. And of course, the city also holds some of the most sacred sites and objects in the American story. In all my years of visiting, I've rarely spent much time in the city's historic district, even when I lived there as a graduate student. Perhaps it's my temperament or perhaps it's my ambivalence about declarations of love of country. But that part of Philadelphia, that really never interested me. I preferred the jazz scene, especially Ortlieb's Jazz House on North 3rd Street, or the bustling pace of South Street on a Saturday afternoon with its throngs of people gathered in and outside of Tower Records. As such, the way the city tells its story and the country story felt fresh to me when I encountered it later. I first saw the Liberty Bell just a few years ago when my in-laws, Jamaican immigrants who fled political violence in 1980, wanted to take in the city's historical sites. This was the birthplace of their adopted country, and so it held some meaning to them. I reluctantly tagged along, feeling an awkward sense of possession and dispossession. Yes, this was the place where the United States was founded, blah, 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 my country, but patriotism for me was off limits, or at least complicated. The idea of America as the birthplace of freedom carried the stench of hypocrisy. The first sentence of the book is, I do not love America and never have, especially now. I'm going to need some security. My in-laws understood this, but theirs was a different experience. They chose to come here. I was a descendant of slaves. James Baldwin had given me language for what I felt. Quote, to be an Afro-American or an American Black is to be in the situation intolerably exaggerated of all those who've ever found themselves part of a civilization which they could in no wise honorably defend, which they were compelled indeed endlessly to attack and condemn, and who yet spoke out of the most passionate love, hoping to make the kingdom new, to make it honorable and worthy of life, end quote. This was Baldwin in 1972. So much has changed and so much has stayed the same. As I walked from historical site to site with my in-laws, the reality of the country's politics shaded everything. We were soaking in a particular story of America's beginnings, the place where the Declaration of Independence was signed, the site where the Constitution was ratified, in a pitched moment of the nation's continued struggle with the contradictions that have always threatened to unravel American democracy. An assault on voting rights, police killings of Black people, recent events had added new chapters to Philadelphia's American story. Large protests erupted there in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Part of Center City burned. The Pennsylvania National Guard was called in and a curfew was put in effect. In response to the protests, the city was forced to engage with its own history of racism. Leaders decided to remove a statue of the notoriously racist mayor and former police commissioner Frank Rizzo. Quote, the statue is a deplorable monument, then Mayor Kenny said, to racism, bigotry, and police brutality from members of the Black community. The city then exploded again. Just a few months later, when police shot and killed Walter Wallace, a 27-year-old Black man in the middle of a mental health crisis, armed with a knife, his parents called for an ambulance. The police showed up instead. Walter was shot 14 times. These contradictions stayed with me, and so I decided to revisit Independence Square in July of 2024. I was working on this book in the run-up to the 250th anniversary of the nation and had grown interested in the early Negro petitions around the immorality of the slave trade and the fugitive slave law submitted to Congress in Philadelphia in 1797 and 1800. These were the first formal political efforts by free Black people in the newly formed country to invoke their constitutional rights and the role and responsibility of the Congress in protecting them. Y'all all right? I just want to check on you. I'm going fast. They insisted that the freedom the country espoused in its own fight for independence and enshrined in the Constitution also belonged to them. That freedom they maintained could not be seized or taken away by others who claimed possession of it. I decided to see Congress Hall, the seat of the nation, from December 1790 to May 1800, and to get a sense of the place where the debates happened. I kept thinking, what would have been the fate of America had the members of Congress made a different moral and political choice about freedom, about Black people, and about themselves? Would the country still be saddled with the race problem? How would the story of the nation be told differently? In the book, I have a whole narration of this moment, but I'm going to skip ahead. In January of 1797, 4 Black men, residents of Philadelphia and formerly enslaved in North Carolina, petitioned Congress for a remedy to the ongoing effort by their former owners to re-enslave them. North Carolina had passed legislation that allowed the, quote, the capture and sale of any former slave freed without the court's consent. And given that many of the country's founders were slave owners and faced the problem of runaway slaves, the U.S. Constitution, of course, as I've mentioned, included a similar provision. The 4 Black men who petitioned Congress sought relief from its burden. Each of them had been freed by their Quaker owners, but the law took their freedom away. That fugitive slave clause took that freedom away, which made it necessary for them to escape. Quote, these are the black men, we were reduced to the necessity of separating from some of our nearest and most tender connections, and of seeking refuge in such parts of the Union where more regard is paid to the public declaration in favor of liberty and the common right of man, end quote. The consequence of the law meant that they would be, quote, hunted day and night like beasts of the forest by armed men with dogs and made a prey of as free and lawful plunder, end quote. The men's petition would be followed by another in December of 1799 and debated in 1800 when 70 free black men from Philadelphia asked Congress to end the slave trade and to reconsider the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 because, quote, the solemn compact, the Constitution, was stained and violated by the trade of kidnapping, end quote. Now, as the tour, imagine, I'm thinking about this as I'm taking this tour of the historic city in Philadelphia, and as the tour began to continue to unfold, I looked around the room in Congress Hall in which we stood. Here was the body, here was where Congress received those petitions and heard the arguments brought before them. In this room, white men decided who were the true possessors of freedom in the country. White men decided who were the possessors of freedom in the country. I noticed the seats and the well and thought of the words of the men who rejected both petitions. Quote, these people have been talked to. They have been tampered with, end quote. One congressman said. He meant that the men could not possibly have arranged for these petitions themselves. Instead, he assumed that radical Quakers who wanted to end slavery once and for all were really behind the appeals. I kept turning over in my head over and over again the phrase tampered with. Isn't that what Toni Morrison's great-grandmother said about her? But anyway. This congressman couldn't believe that black people wanted to live freely, nor that we would petition Congress on our own for that freedom. And in a way, it didn't matter for him whether the issue involved Quakers or slaveholders. Freedom was the white man's gift to give or to take away. James Jones of Georgia could not imagine that the rights delineated in the Constitution applied to these black people, to people like me. He spoke to his fellow white men, quote, I would ask gentlemen whether with all their philanthropy, they would wish to see these people deliberating in the councils of the nation, end quote. The word philanthropy churned in my head. The matter of justice didn't concern him. I thought of Moses Gordon and the note scribbled on the back of his manumission papers. He chose a different kind of freedom. With every anniversary of the nation's founding, the divided soul of America, this idea of the country as a beacon of freedom and a white republic, is experiencing the convulsions around race that threaten to tear the country apart. As Americans celebrate 250 years of existence, we are faced with a resurgence in white nationalism. Panic has grabbed hold of millions of Americans as they fret about the so-called Great Replacement, among other things, and that panic has led many to believe that the primary purpose of Donald Trump's administration is to take back the country for them. Trumpism, among the many things that it is and aspires to be, is a restorative project. It aims to reclaim an American past where white people were at the center, the standard bearers, the measure for what is truly American. In his vision, the diversity of the nation is an ancillary feature of the American story, Ellis Island a minor plot. The dramatic expansion of ICE aims to ensure that this vision of the country is made real. In the quote-unquote one big beautiful bill, the Republican-led Congress allocated $170 billion for immigration and border security and $75 billion in extra funding for ICE to aid the agency's arrest and deportation efforts and for the immigration detention system. ICE is now the highest funded law enforcement agency in the federal government, larger than the FBI. And its purpose extends beyond the law. It is charged to help make America white again. Whatever view of America, U.S.A. emerged during the 1960s social revolutions, whatever gains around race the nation has made since that period, whether it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Immigration Act of 1965, or the election of the first African-American president, these Americans want to snatch them away. They want to rip apart the infrastructure put in place to remedy, however piecemeal, historical harms. They want to do away with the tensions that come with the exposure of America's double consciousness. These Americans want to turn back the clock to ensure a future for the country that looks like what they desire. Sentimentality and rage rest at the heart of this lurching back and forth between attempts to address racial justice and the denials that racial injustice exists at all. Conscience pricked by the realization of cruelty in our midst often spur attempts to repent for the country's national sins. Americans engage in the mortification of the flesh. Images of dogs sicked on children marching in Birmingham, the video of George Floyd crying out for his mother as he lay dying with the police officer's knee on his neck, or children crying as moms are arrested by ICE officers outside of their school. These are all behaviors and practices that fail to align with what Dos Passos would call a storybook version of America. In the face of public outrage and protest, the country tries to repent and reassert its inherent goodness. Quote, "This isn't who we are," right? They say. White America sees its complicity in the cruelty and seeks absolution in its admission rather than in remedying the cruelty. Let me read that sentence again. White America sees its complicity in the cruelty and seeks absolution in its admission rather than in remedying the cruelty. And when the absolution is not given, and Black people continue to demand justice, resentment boils over. Cries of enough are heard. Shouts for the rule of law ring out, and all hell breaks loose. We see examples of this cycle of sentimentality and rage across American history. Think about the aims of Reconstruction and the ugliness of redemption, or the moral power of the Black freedom movement of the mid-20th century and the backlash that culminated in the election of Ronald Reagan, or the response to George Floyd's murder and today's assault on all things DEI. An admission of guilt has been made, and an acknowledgement of racism has been given, and that, a segment of white America believes, should be enough. But Black people push too hard, and like a spring coiled too tight, white America snaps back. The motivation to repent for racism, more often than not, has little to do with Black people, with those who have endured and continue to endure the cruelty of racism or some particular policy, or even with the broader question of justice. Rather, oftentimes, many in white America seem to desire freedom from the tyranny of the mirror, from the judgment that says with contempt and pity that you are not who you say you are. For how can the country be a beacon of freedom and a white republic? How can both be true? A desperate desire for the absolution of sin is needed, a confession that wipes the ledger clean and allows for a healthy-minded American innocence as a Minneapolis cop keeps his knee on the neck of a Black man calling for his mom. Sentimentality buries the harsh reality underneath what the poet Wallace Stevens called a failure of feeling. It matters regarding race. It matters regarding race. It distorts, that is, sentimentality, distorts the moral senses insofar as it misrepresents Black people and the reasons for their suffering in order to indulge white America's feelings. Through the sentimental eye, we become these flat, uncomplicated characters who needlessly suffer and cry out for white America's sympathies and charity, philanthropy turning over in my head. Living, breathing Black people lost in blurry, wet eyes, crying crocodile tears for their conditions. Rarely, if ever, are we actual human beings whose complex humanity must be confronted. Instead, white America asks, what can we do for them? How might we change their conditions? Harriet Beecher Stowe's character, Uncle Tom, stands in for the actual slaves in our midst. Urged on by Stowe's sentimental moral appeal, those who decried the evil of slavery were then horrified by the idea that these people, freed from bondage, might want to vote and take on the burdens of American citizenship. Or later in the early 20th century, a wealthy white patron weeps at the performance of Negro spirituals, what W.B. Du Bois calls the sorrow songs, weeps at the performance of Negro spirituals on a stage in a Jim Crow theater for white people only. White self-indulgence characterizes the sentiment. Black people can be easily forgotten or rendered invisible in the blink of an eye. No wonder Oscar Wilde in De Profundis thought of the sentimentalist as, quote, one who desires to have the luxury of an emotion without paying for it. White America cries its tears and leaves the world exactly as it is. Sentimentality also terribly simplifies the moral situation. In some ways, we saw this in the discussions of Robin DiAngelo and white privilege and Ibram Kendi's ideas about anti-racism. Quote, the only remedy to racist discrimination, Kendi asserted, is anti-racist discrimination, end quote. Let's leave aside that justice talk, to my mind, should not be rendered as a form of discrimination, ever. But in these prescriptions, white Americans were urged to turn inward and to search within themselves for traces of racist commitments, to engage in ongoing self-flagellation, as if that would be enough to bring about a racially just society. What an ironic indulgence of their feelings. But this sentimentality would shape larger approaches to the problem, right? Quote unquote problem. Corporations announce massive investments in diversity and inclusion and equity, but through programs of dubious effectiveness. And in an obvious lament about it all, David Bromwich of Yale wrote in Harper's Magazine that, quote, the manner of these declarations of commitment to diversity and social justice was unusual. Pledges of solidarity commonly took the form of confessions. The point was not to explain conditions, end quote. And when the demands for critical self-examination did not result in absolution, when all of this self-flagellation on the part of white Americans did not bring forgiveness, only more demands, the whiplash was harsh and intense. Sentimentality is intimately connected with the rage that often comes with its failure. No wonder James Baldwin, understood it as the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel, and it is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity. Sentimentality, for Baldwin, is the mask of cruelty. You see it in the way the country has turned so vicious after the outpouring of sentiment after George Floyd's murder, how people have become so mean-spirited as they express their hatreds and grievances, how DEI, once considered a remedy to racial harms, is now seen as a curse and the weapon of a radical cabal hell-bent on destroying America. Behind the tears and cries that we can be better was a devious smirk which revealed that all of this was just a lie. Just 5 years ago, we were engaged in a reckoning, and now they're trying to mainstream Charlie Kirk's views, to coerce us into consenting to what he believes. When sentimentality fails, as it inevitably does, the turn to rage is seamless. Because the oppressed black victim that cries out for sympathy is bound to the radical black person who refuses subjugation. First, we are the blameless, caricatured victim. Then, when we continue to press our case, we become the raging radical that is the object of intense hatred. Black people constantly demanding justice threatens chaos. Both the victim, though, and the radical are caricatures. A monstrous Nat Turner is the flip side of the pious Uncle Tom. This is the source of what the historian Carol Anderson calls white rage, that allergic reaction to the demand for black freedom and the ongoing resistance to white domination, rage directed towards that figure who refuses either to submit or to forgive. If Storybook America is to hold, one way or another, the nation's sins must be wiped clean, either by confession or by violence, both real and symbolic, with the goal of erasure. White rage justifies the undoing of any effort to resolve the warring souls of America and to live genuinely the American promise. Here in the hands of those who cry sentimental tears, freedom remains white America's possession to give. And when white America tires of the effort, they work with passion and rage at getting shut of the problem by any means necessary. What matters here, what has always mattered in America, U.S.A., is that the country simultaneously remains a beacon of freedom and a white nation. But since the beginning, the presence of black people and Native peoples have unmasked the lies that hide the doubleness that divided soul. That deceit became the source of our national suffering because white Americans had to lie to themselves and to the world about their commitment to liberty and equality for all. And that's a riff on the Grand Inquisitor. What is the line from the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky? This deceit will constitute our suffering, for we shall have to lie. Too many Americans, sorry. That's a little Kojic moment for me. From the Catholic boy on the coast of Mississippi. No, it's so American. Too many Americans, I know I want to bring it to a close. Is that okay? Because I want to open it up for some time. Too many Americans have been willing to toss their democratic commitments into the trash bin in defense of lies and on behalf of an insidious idea that the color of one's skin determines one's value. In this formulation, Black people, among others, become less than human. That was part of the argument for slavery. We are lazy and criminal. They use lies like these as reasons to deny us full citizenship. Immigrants, both today and a century ago, threatened to pollute American society, another lie, a justification, no matter the story of Ellis Island, for cruelty at the border and at home. When people are made less than human, one is given license to treat them accordingly. You can separate families, snatch them from their loved ones, sell them on auction blocks, even their babies, or round them up, separate them from their children, and send them wherever you like. American history, soaked in a sentimental dishonesty, offers cover for it all. In the storybook, America must always ultimately stand for good, an idea supposedly rooted in Judeo-Christian principles that undergird the nation's founding and give the country its unique mission in the world. Civil religion has been conscripted to protect America's national innocence. No matter what the country does, no matter how cruel the policies, we are always, so the story goes, on the road to a more perfect union. But that version of the American story runs up against the rage that reveals something darker and more sinister. White rage can take many forms, but its intent is always to secure the storybook America. The storybook America. Today, that effort involves banning books and passing legislation that forbids teaching subjects that make our students feel uncomfortable. It involves now not a red scare, but a woke scare. What we're experiencing now around cancel culture has the structure of the McCarthy era, right, in interesting sorts of ways, but it's not the ideology of communism that's driving it, right? It's something else that we need to really, really think about, right? DEI has become the latest cudgel to beat us all into submission. And the assassination of Charlie Kirk has become one of its key weapons in this moment. And I don't say this to condone or to minimize the horror of that political violence. I'm more interested in the way in which it is being used in this current moment to silence speech, right? To endanger opponents. And I think all of this is with the aim of making real the fantasy of a lily white America. The lies that take root in the habits of our daily living, they color how we see the world and how we live or fail to live our values. Above all, the lies absolve the nation of any responsibility for what has been done or is being done in our name, so Americans can tell themselves that innocence remains. But Moses Gordon's ghost screams otherwise. Every generation, we find ourselves grappling in one way or another with the fact of racism and racial inequality in this country. But something deeper is revealed in the repetition. Race splits America's national consciousness in two. And the country has twisted and contorted itself to hide and conceal the monstrous consequences of the doubleness that sits at its heart. and that has kept so many white Americans, I believe, from discovering who they really are as Americans. Ralph Ellison described it as this way: since the beginning of the nation, quote, white Americans have suffered from a deep uncertainty as to who they really are. One of the ways that has been used to simplify the answer has been to seize upon the presence of black Americans and use them as a marker or symbol of limits, a metaphor for the outsider. Perhaps this is why one of the first epithets that many European immigrants learned when they got off the boat was the term nigger. Excuse my language. It made them feel instantly American, end quote. But this is tricky magic. Illusions and sleight of hands that lead some to believe that this is a white republic, even as the sounds and bustles of American living suggest something much more soulful. As Ellison suggested, what is really troubling for some is that deep down in the cracks and crevices of this country, America is also somehow black, a reality our commemorations, and especially this 250th anniversary, desperately tries to deny. In 1804, and I'm coming to a close for real. I don't want to abuse, you got to be democratic in this stuff, right? In 1804, 4 years after Congress rejected the petition, and in the year of Haiti's formal independence, several hundred young black men gathered in the southward district of Philadelphia, not too far from what is now Independence Square. They organized themselves in military formation with swords and weapons, commemorated the 4th of July by marching through the streets of the city for 2 days, and threatened white people, the white people they encountered. At one point it was reported the men were heard, quote, damning the whites and saying that they would show them like in Saint Domingue, end quote. Theirs was a different kind of celebration of the 4th, one in which they would strike the blow for their own freedom, a freedom they claimed and possessed. Moses Gordon, however, chose freedom in death. Freedom snatchers forced the choice upon him. What might his life teach us today? How might his particular journey and the rejection of those early petitions expose the beating heart of America, U.S.A., where there's the comma, the separation, the divided soul, as opposed to the hyphen that connects us? And how might the cruel repetition he endured chasten our celebration of American freedom after 250 years? What was revealed then and what we know now is that too many in this country believe that freedom is the white man's gift to give and to take away still. The morbid sense about which Du Bois wrote, which I didn't read, and which the melancholy that Tocqueville noted so long ago, which I skipped over, still covers the land. I'm reminded of the enslaved men of the Sweet Home Plantation in Toni Morrison's classic novel, Beloved. Their owner, Mr. Garner, gave them wide latitude. They were men insofar as Mr. Garner believed he was a man, right? Their freedom was an extension of his own. But with Garner's death and the arrival of school teacher, the brutal brother of the dead slave master, the men of Sweet Home were treated now as nothing but slaves and subject to the cruelty that came with being one. The character Paul D, now free and struggling with the memories of his days at Sweet Home, tells of his experience wearing the iron bit, a cruel instrument used by slave masters to bridle a slave's tongue, and of an old rooster called Mister. It is a story about freedom snatching, of the harrowing implication of white men having the power to offer freedom and then to take it away. Here Paul D sat bound with his hands behind his back and a bit in his mouth, only to see a rooster that he helped break out of his shell stand above him, free and fully, as he said, his mean self. That sight drove him to the brink of madness. Quote, yeah, he was hateful, all right, talking about Mister, the rooster. Bloody too and evil, crooked feet flapping, comb as big as my hand and some kind of red. He sat right there on the tub looking at me. I swear he smiled. I wasn't even thinking about the bit, just Hallie and before him 6-0. But when I saw Mister, I knew it was me too. One crazy, one soul, one missing, one burnt, and me licking iron with my hands crossed behind my back, the last of the Sweet Home men. Mister, he looked so free, better than me. Stronger, tougher, son of a bitch, couldn't even get out of his shell by himself, but he was still king and I was. Paul D stopped and squeezed his left hand with his right. Mister was allowed to be and stay what he was, but I wasn't allowed to be and stay what I was. Even if you cooked him, you'd be cooking a rooster named Mister. but wasn't no way I'd ever be Paul D again, living or dead. School teacher changed me. I was something else, and that something else was less than a chicken sitting in the sun on a tub, end quote. Broken. Paul D was forced to contend with what that experience deposited in his soul. Freedom belonged to them, even to a damn rooster he helped saved. With this scene, Morrison takes us to the heart of the moral calamity that follows from the hubris that someone, because of the color of their skin, can claim freedom as their own possession. This is a novel, but it is no fiction. Still today, we are forced to contend with the whirlwind of sentimentality and rage as many in America, white America, claim freedom and the country as their own. Amidst this racist clamoring, I'm left with this sinking feeling that despite all the talk of ours being the greatest nation on earth, we have become ghost-like, standing on the edge of the final catastrophe, clinging to hope, not haunted by the past alone, but stricken by a future that has come and gone. Hear the redemptive promise of America, that sacred future inaugurated on July 4th, which has allowed the country to look beyond its vices and failures, feels empty. Relics and ruins remain. Storybook appeals amount to sticking one's head in the sand. What America can be, what it could be, seems lost as the present, with its cruelty, loneliness, and with Donald Trump in the White House again, chokes on the past that the country refuses to remember. I keep asking myself, and perhaps this is the bitterness in me, what happens to the American idea? What happens to the meaning of the 4th of July when the future is no longer available to it? When we may not have another chance to make it all right, to make good on the American promise, because too many white Americans are too damn committed to being valued above everyone else. Thank you so much.
You want to sit? You want to take some questions and
I'll take
conversation?
some questions. Sure.
Okay,
Y'all can
we'll stay here.
break me over the coals.
Stay here. We have a microphone. Wow.
Thank you.
Wow.
It's the first time I've ever read that out loud,
Beautiful.
at least to anybody else. I read it out loud to myself, of course.
Powerful, unflinching, unsentimental. Did I hear Wallace Stevens in there?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Just relentless. The floor is open. Thank you so much, Eddie, for
Thank
really a
you.
brilliant reading.
Thank you, students, for
Okay.
bearing with me. I appreciate you. Y'all are so patient. Yes, Doc.
I'll break the ice. That's the question.
Well, obviously that was great. Thank you. And it was even beautiful to watch you read it and your own emotions as you read it, the power of it. But so the question is, any science fiction or thoughts of a science fiction type literary approach that could reimagine if different decisions have been made, what might, is that even useful to even think about what, if we could reimagine if different things in history had taken place, what could have happened?
Well, sure. I think, there's always, I think the Afro-pessimist, when she wants to go constructive, has to suddenly morph into an Afro-futurist, right? Otherwise, it can't be constructive in light of the world as it is, it seems to me. So I think, there are resources to be had in science fiction. The imagination, for me, is the source of the critical work to open up a different future. But as a pragmatist, that it takes place within the context of our doings and sufferings. So I don't have to leap to a world that isn't instantiated as of yet, but the as yet can become the basis for which I intervene in the now. So I have to articulate very clearly a set of values and commitments and principles in our current moment as a way of opening up space for how we might imagine ourselves being together differently. So I can find resources, Butler and others, to help do that work. But I tend to agree with Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He says God speaks to us through our imaginations, and so I believe that's that hard work. And whenever I tell my students that, I said, if that's true, then what is the devil doing? He's speaking to us through our imagination, aiming to shut it down. So imagination is the key battleground. And so we draw on all the resources we can. Sam Delaney, others, right? I'm a J.R.R. Tolkien guy too, as complicated as Tolkien is. Terry Brooks too, I love The Sword of Shannara. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm Jim Miller, and
Hi, Jim.
for
Thank
many
you.
years was a rock critic and have written also about, the 60s and the social movements. What you just said about Emerson, if you could stay with that for a moment. Emerson, of course, in Self-Reliance wonders if it's the devil who speaks to him or God, and that's a problem for transcendentalism. But isn't the imagination itself a realm of sentiment? And weren't you right when you said that sentiment is akin to other passions like anger? And in the account that you gave, you said, you quoted Ralph Ellison towards the end of your talk. And I think I heard you say, quote, America is somehow black?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I've always loved Ralph Ellison, and as a white American, I've always felt, and this is, just hear me out, that I am somehow black, and I feel that way because the music I listen to and I grew up on, all of which came out of minstrelsy, is miscegenation music that combines sentimentality with imagining outlaw, rebellion, resistance, and that it is the first major industry in America to be integrated was the music business. And going all the way from ragtime music publishers to modern day rap, hip hop, all of which I see as being power, they occupy a central part of the American story. And it would seem to me it's a much more disruptive and doubled part. Because anybody who pretends to be a white Negro, as Norman Mailer put it, is choosing to be doubled, alienated, and estranged. And when my son decided to go put up tags in Boston and got arrested by the police, he wanted to be black. And I don't think he was alone. And I think that that's a story that now is about 150 years long. And I wonder what you make of it, knowing that you care about black music.
So, when I say, when I read Ellison as saying somehow at the heart, on the lower frequencies, we speak for you, that line out of Invisible Man, or that moment in Fireworks Time in '63 when Baldwin says something similar, that America must, in some ways, become black. What he's saying in that moment, at least Baldwin is saying in that moment, and I want to extend it to Ellison, even though they're not the same, is that he wants the country to confront the tragic. He doesn't want the country to be this death-dodging civilization, a country that actually can tend to suffering, can linger there, right? Because its prospective approach means that it's going to run past suffering. We're always already on the road to a more perfect union, right? 600,000 are dead, right? And we're going to move quickly, right? Think about the quote-unquote Spanish flu, right? How many hundreds of thousands of people are dead? And the period that follows it is what? The Roaring 20s. We're doing the Charleston, right? So there's a sense in which this insistence, blackness in this moment isn't about cultural appropriation, right? Norman Mailer's white Negro, right, raised the hackles on Jimmy's neck, right? It's not about that. It's about what does it mean to encounter, right, an aspect of what it means to take one's first breath, which means you immediately start to die. Right? That the great scandal of Western modernity is the fact of death. And when you encounter these black folk, right, in the fullness of who they are in this country, you're going to have to deal with, you're going to have to linger in, right, suffering. You're going to have to linger in not just simply suffering, but the way in which they have forged a life in the midst of that suffering. right? So it's not just simply, right, appropriating a sound, right? But to understand, what does it mean? I say this in the book. What does it mean that the fact of our presence here deposited a blue note at the heart of the nation? What does that mean for all of us, right? Beyond playing the music, or because on the lower frequencies, right, in the spaces of culture, right, these categories make no damn sense. Your English, right, our English, the very English we speak, right, is a reflection of the complexity of this place. You know what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? Now, in terms of the first part of the question around sentiment, I mean, we can have a debate about the philosophy of sentiment, you know, what the relationship between sentiment and sentimentality. You know, I could talk about the passions. For me, Aristotle says anger is the source of virtue, right? And the ways in which he thinks about the passions, right? And so I'm thinking about sentimentality in a very specific sort of way, right? And perhaps we can have that debate another time, because I would be interested in, I don't ever read the imagination, right, as the working of sentimentality, right? I actually see it as the source of freedom, or a source of freedom. Any more? Yes, hey.
Hi.
I will be shorter with my answers, I promise.
No, not at all.
And by the way, Jim, I love your socks. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So I have a far less imaginative question for you. And I'm just eager to hear your thoughts. I don't expect you to have an answer per se. Your talk was so wonderful in making so many brilliant connections that were so illuminating for the current moment and for this whole American project over history. But I'm still left at the end of your talk as perplexed as I've ever been about why we saw more African Americans voting for Trump in the last election. And I know I'm really getting very prosaic here in comparison to the previous questions that were answered, but I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Well, I always say this, that, white men, right, cisgendered men don't have a monopoly on selfishness and greed. They don't have a monopoly on being self-interested. Now, we can deal with the numbers. We can actually query whether or not the numbers were as much, as folks suggest. But I want to say that oftentimes what happens is that we read Black people as if we're not complex human beings with different kinds of political positions and different interests. And so you have folk who are greedy, folk who are misogynistic, folk who are selfish, and folk who are caught up in a certain kind of political theatrics, right? And so I don't see us as outside of those dynamics, right, in any shape, form, or fashion. So, I have this line in the book where I said, in effect, where I try to use this analogy. I say race, not everything in the U.S. is about race, but yet everything seems to be. And I have this analogy, right? Think of the Constitution, and think of the ink well next to the Constitution spilling on it. And in order to see it, you got to hold it in the light. So race stains everything, but everything isn't reducible to it, right? It's always present, but it's not the only way. So part of that's a long-winded way of saying that race matters in a lot of ways, but in other ways, these people are doing things that are driven by their own self-interest. So that's my real commonsensical answer. White folk don't have a monopoly on being mean. Well, they don't. And so you got some selfish folk out there.
I have a kind of follow-up question to that, which is, why did more white women vote for Trump? Because I think that
there's
Black
that.
men and white men have the same social, political, economic distance from one another as white women to white men. We have as much, if not more so, to risk and have risked since he was elected the first and the second times. And so I feel like a corollary to that question is not just why more Black men did, but we have to ask ourselves and reflect internally about white women as well, and not assume that the proximity of Black men to white men is not equal to, if not more so, the proximity of white women to white men.
Right, so we didn't go into the numbers in terms of, the various constituencies and who voted for the group, the demographics, who voted for whom and what. I didn't go into all of that. But I remember sitting around the table at MSNBC. I'm around Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace, Claire McCaskill, Senator Claire McCaskill's there, Nicole's there. And before that, I was on Morning Joe, and Mika's there. And I had this thing. I said, I don't know if the only way Kamala Harris is going to win is if white women have to turn out and vote for her. I said this. And so I'm sitting at the table with Mika first, and I go, so I have this feeling that the only way she's going to be able to win is that white women are going to have to vote for her in large numbers. Because the black voter turnout is not going to be as high as it once was. In previous, white women are going to have to take, and you know what she did? I don't know. Claire McCaskill, several hours later, that's a hard one, Eddie. Now, mind you, I'm sitting here thinking about the implications of what it would mean for white women to have this man in the White House. But they offered no account for why this would be the case in this instance, right? And the way in which race works in this moment, right? And the like. And of course, I did this at the New York Historical Society as well. I said the same thing at the New York Historical Society, or now it's New York Historical. I can't say society. And I said, she won't win unless white women turn out. And someone blurted out, she won't win. Right? She won't win. And they were right.
Listen, it's heating up back here. There's many questions in the back
Sure,
row.
I'll be quick.
So,
I'll be quick.
are you ready?
Students, yes.
I just want to say thank you for coming and for the talk. I'm thinking about the idea of this, of like the contradiction and those tensions and that kind of dual consciousness, and I'm wondering what you would, if you've, I guess just the idea that maybe instead of a contradiction, this is kind of like the logical consequence of a freedom and morality that's founded on the principles that you were mentioning, like if you think about the Constitution and like just what America is founded on, if this outcome is not really a contradiction, but kind of just the logical conclusion of those principles, because I think that also has an impact on the way that we kind of move forward, right? Like if it's a contradiction, it's something that you can remedy, but if it's integral to the fabric of America, that's a whole different kind of thing. And I guess the distinction that you made between Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism, right? Like that kind of destruction that would have to happen if it's not a contradiction and it's just like, so I guess I'm just thinking about how you engage with that idea.
Yeah, so in Democracy in Black, I actually state the claim that, we've built the country true. What we see, Mississippi didn't happen by accident, right? It is what it is because of cascading choices, the consequences of choices made over time, right? And so I'm thinking to myself that the admission of that, right, sets the stage for the sort of kind of problem solving that follows, right? Once we say the country is the result of a set of policy decisions, deliberate policy decisions, inequality is not the result of bad choices made by people. Just logically, the condition of black folk, just as a specific example, it just doesn't make any sense that it's the result of millions of micro bad choices being made every single day that generate these outcomes. That doesn't make any sense, right? So once we concede the truth of the matter, then we could be as deliberate in dismantling it as we were in creating it. That's my thinking, right? But what I'm trying to do in this book, right, is to disrupt the storytelling that's going to be a part of the 250th. Because what's happening is that they're going to go back, what they're doing is narrating a story of the country that justifies their vision of the country. And they're doing something that's really, really radical, to my mind. They're rejecting the move that has been made since the bicentennial. So the bicentennial, 76, is the first time that a president recognizes Negro History Week. And then this is the year that Black History Month is instituted as well, right? And so this is the moment where you begin to embrace an idea of America. It's really those white ethnics who were often seen as, in the 1926, in the sesquicentennial, the white ethnics who were seen as invasion, as a viral threat, have now become the true Americans in 1976. And part of the challenge is, how do we absorb the story of the Black freedom struggle into the American story? So you have to then redact it. So King becomes a part of it. The movement becomes a part of it. By 1980, Reagan signs King's holiday into law. It's surrounded by a whole bunch of nastiness, but King is now ushered into America's civil religion, and it becomes a part of the More Perfect Union talk. They don't give a damn about More Perfect Union talk. In fact, July 5th, J.D. Vance, in response to Mamdani, said, "How dare you talk about our country being still broken? If it wasn't for us, you wouldn't be here. You should show gratitude." For them, it's an evangelical commitment to the founding, right? Salvation was secured in the beginning. So there's no talk of an ark of a more perfect union, none whatsoever. And so part of what we're going to see is a redaction, an erasure. And what I'm trying to do in the book is tell a story about how that's happening and why we need to pay attention to it. With the understanding, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. With the understanding, though, that all of this, who we are, is a result of deliberate policy decisions, deliberate choices. Yes?
Thank you so much.
I hope that made sense.
I was deeply uncomfortable and so inspired at the same time. This morning I was commuting and reading and listening to Ezra Klein's article, and his point about we're all, okay, thank you. We're all gonna live here together now. And his point about Charlie Kirk was practicing politics in the right way.
For those of you who are West Indian, you know the sound of that. And I just kiss my teeth.
So now are we at a point where mainstream media is really going that far as to giving narrative to something so unjust? And I had to close my phone and take a deep breath. So I just wanted to get your opinion and thoughts on that.
Yes, we are. We live in a moment in which there's a kind of convergence of a number of different things: greed, selfishness, and hatred, a kind of cowardice and indifference. For the last 40 years, we have witnessed in so many ways an all-out assault on any robust notion of the public good, a kind of evisceration of the public square, where it becomes very difficult for me and you to imagine our responsibilities to each other. Right? And so that isolation, that atomism, right, is working in as part and parcel of what they're doing as they try, right, to literally, I think, undermine the basic foundations of the Republic. Ezra Klein is wrong. He's wrong. And he's wrong for a number of different reasons, right? Charlie Kirk was not interested in debate. Charlie Kirk was just simply the latest instantiation or the latest manifestation of a crossfire approach. You guys remember Crossfire on CNN? For younger folks, like, what the hell is Crossfire on CNN? Crossfire was just this debate between someone on the right, Tucker was in there, Novak was in there, and then someone on the left, right, Paul Begala or something like that, right? And it was just simply a performance of disagreement. The show was the disagreement. No one was ever convinced otherwise. So when disagreement becomes the point, right, entertainment, right, that's not debate, that's not deliberation. That's actually an indication of the evisceration of the public sphere. Right? So Charlie Kirk would come to a college camp. He actually asked me to debate him. I said, I only debate my equals, bruh. Right? So he actually came, that's a John Henrik Clark move, right? So he actually comes to a college campus, or he used to come to a campus, and he would hold forth, right? And the audience wasn't his interlocutor. The audience were those who were already in his orbit, who could be convinced, right, by the performance, not by the substance of the claim. So I don't know what Ezra is thinking. I do, actually. You know, market-based sensibilities travel across different spheres, right? Right? And so the idea of mainstreaming this, right? I mean, I don't know if you've read Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece in Vanity Fair, where that's all he does is he quotes, literally quotes everything Kirk said. And it's like, go ahead. Well, he condemns it up front, but what he's trying to do is he's trying to ask the question, what does it mean to mainstream this? What does it mean to say he was a champion of free speech, right? You know, I've come to understand the power of the absolutist position with regards to free speech. But I think if you're going to hold it, you have to be diligent about certain forms of speech that aim to undermine the background conditions that allow for your community to work. Because some people will use those background values as a way to undermine the very enterprise itself. So they come in and take advantage of your values to undermine the institution as such. So you have to be diligent even as you open up space for disagreement. I mean, for a variety of positions, even noxious ones, right? So to my mind, political violence is always wrong. I wasn't raised to revel in somebody's death, but I'm not going to be coerced to celebrate someone's views that I fundamentally reject. I don't disagree with Charlie Kirk. I reject his worldview, right? And I'm not going to be made to mourn that. Imagine, just really quickly, to my mind, and I know this is on tape, so I might get fired tomorrow, who knows? And I'm being honest.
Eddie.
But I would say this really quickly, Will. It seems to me, just imagine, this is the analogy. Imagine George Wallace being shot. And the demand is that you accept his views as opposed to just embracing the man. Just imagine. No one was asked to accept his position, but people can be loving in their will, in their hope and prayer that he survives. I don't understand how we are allowing people to coerce us to concede to the mainstreaming of these ideas, because that's what's happening.
So it's heating up now on this side of the room, and time is running a little short. So can we collect a few comments?
Sure, and I'll be quick, and I'm lying.
Two in a row right here.
Oh, I have a question. Is that all right? Yeah.
Go, and then Christoph.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I thought you very powerfully articulated the way in which white America has refused to confront its actual history in a way that could actually potentially ever lead to repair. And I wonder, as you look at the country now, are there any even microscopic places where you see processes in play where something appears to be happening that suggests some form of actually the productive version of that encounter that could actually lead towards repair?
Yeah. Okay.
So it very much related to that, Steve. So I was really interested in your your emotional, your affective analysis, which I think is really remarkable. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of the comments. One, the comment you mentioned a moment ago about Aristotle, and then the Dostoevsky comment as well. But I'll be quick. I guess I want to say, is there? So you made the claim that thought of a kind of white rage that's really connected to sort of a self-indulgence, a kind of narcissism that actually cares nothing about liberation. And I'm interested in, and it made me think of Dostoevsky's comments about laceration, this kind of like, which is in that book thought of as just the most self-indulgent, sort of repulsive kind of emotion, right? Exactly. But I wonder if you could distinguish between that, very much along the lines of Steve's comment, between that version of white rage that's super self-indulgent and one that could be potentially in the service of actual liberation of not just of oneself, but actually of others.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's what
I think the adjective is doing a lot of work for me. The adjective white rage, white is doing a lot of work for me. Rage, anger is productive, appropriate anger, to use Aristotle's language. It's actually necessary. If you aren't angry about certain matters in the world, it actually reflects something about your moral character, right? If you can't get angry about certain evils in the world, right? Aristotle goes, if you're not going to respond angrily at someone, dishonoring you, then, something's wrong with you. He actually has a word for it, right? So rage and anger, right? I think populist rage, populist anger, rightly understood, appropriately expressed, make all the sense in the world to me, right? But what happens when white rage is expressed, right? Because I'm thinking about it within this kind of cycle around the way in which the country refuses to deal with this divided soul, that right rage is actually a reflection of the ongoing demand to confront oneself. And instead of just giving the absolution, right, damn it, it's the snapping back. Get back in your place. Get out of sight. Because this is Ellison's point. Whenever the country, he writes this in Time magazine in 1970, whenever the country tires of the question of racial justice, it seeks to get shut of Black people, and it reaches for the fantasy of secession. It reaches for the fantasy of a lily-white republic. This is Ellison in 1970. Now, Ellison is a patriot, by the way, right? This is not Richard Wright. This is Ralph Ellison, right? He supports the Vietnam War, so he's making this description in 1970. So I want to hold on to the productive value of anger. I'm teaching a course right now entitled Black Rage and Black Power. And I began with a lecture that moved from Aristotle to Martha Nussbaum to Audre Lorde, trying to frame the way in which anger works politically, right? So that we can reorient ourselves to that political moment. So I don't want to make that move. I'm just trying to think about what white rage is doing coming out of Carol Anderson's thing. In terms of examples, there are plenty. I don't think they and I could go through them, but where I am now, they don't map onto the scale of what we're experiencing. All the trains are running at once. And I was saying, was it to you, President? I think I was saying to you, President House, right? That I was like, I feel like I need to reread Sartre's No Exit. Because there are days, because I'm in the midst of it and I have to tell people what the drums are saying all the time. There are days when I just go, holy fuck, I don't know how we're gonna get out of this, right? And I worry that our nostalgia for the 60s as a form of protest, as a strategy of response, actually hamstrings us. Because, marches aren't going to do this, right? We have to do something to disrupt the passive positionality of Americans in this current moment, beyond just simply a performance of virtue. Maybe we share some Irish whiskey together. I'm trying to imagine what that work will look like by opening up space for us to do that kind of thinking, right? Because it's not about we cannot march. No, they're waiting for that, right? Will it be wildcat boycotts? Will it be a general strike? Will it be something? We have to do something dramatically different because the scale of what they're doing dwarfs what Reagan did in 80. Because he came in with a similar heritage blueprint. But what they're doing is resetting across the board. And white liberals, many of whom, I can say this at the new school because I feel comfortable here. Many are using this as cover to reset. We live amid modern day copperheads. That's the only way I can describe the Great Capitulation. That's what I'm calling it. We live among modern day copperheads. So it's not just the loud ones. It's the other ones who are using this as cover to reset in order to snatch back the gains, to snatch back what was relinquished, to remake these institutions that gave up too much, right, during the reckoning.
Let's thank Eddie Gloud.
Oh, we should say something more positive.